welcome so much to taking part in Lamrim, in the Lamrim. I want to start off with generating motivation. And again, classically, this is first of all to take refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, and to allow ourselves to find a sense of openness, a lack of arrogance, a sense of humility, or the ability to listen, to understand, and to focus on the Dharma. Despite Ben's flaws, I'm hoping that some of this will still be inspirational for the purpose of developing ourselves for the benefit of all beings. So what our aim individually is to spend as much of our time as we can to work and to be sincere in our journey of the spiritual path, according to our own understanding and determination, with the guidance that's given by Lord Buddha. So it's good to think about the suffering of all beings and the many that we're aware of and the many more that we're not, as the object of our compassion and our loving kindness, and out of a sense of love, kindness, and a wish to help. That's the basis of our motivation to say, okay, I want to take on some responsibility to help, and the best way I can do that is through external action, yes, but also internal action of helping my mind be trained in a way which benefits all beings and myself, coincidentally. So I think that's nice. So this week we are looking at the penultimate chapter of the base scope of to do with the path shared with those who are concerned with low rebirth, or with high rebirth rather. But this is still a Mahayana tradition. A large amount of this is shared with the Theravadins, and is taught based mainly though on the teachings of a Sangha who introduced the compassion path, the compassion thread or lineage within Mahayana Buddhism. It's quite a long chapter, so we're not going to do it all today. It follows on from our discussion on karma as action in last week. So this was really primarily concerning with the idea of saying that once we accept that we need to be good, we need to learn, Buddha's famous quote of learn to do good, cease to do evil. This is what we're recognizing, is learning how to do good and how to cease doing evil. And this really is the key aspect of the Buddhist path. So what is good, what is evil? These are the important questions we need to be able to see, but also how do we learn to do good and how do we learn to cease to do evil? Because it doesn't come easily. Especially, I think we've all had an experience where we can revisit something that we feel quite a strong resentment about, and when we do, then it comes again and again and again. It's rather like a stuck record, if you like, and it's like, oh, here we are again. But often we don't even see it before we're caught up in it. So what we're working on is to try to develop some of those techniques for working out how to change our minds or change our behaviors as well, which are linked to our minds, in order to modify and inform our activity, the way we take part in the world, engage in the world, from moment to moment. So what we're really interested in, trying to find ways of engaging in activity that helps us in our moment-to-moment lives. Like everything I've been talking about so far, or I should say Lama Tsongkhapa has been talking about so far, such as death awareness, we don't do this because it's in the books. We do it because we recognize that when we begin to accept and recognize the truth of death, we find a series of benefits to our lives. So it's because of these things like death awareness or precious human rebirth and so on, that what we're able to do is to use these to help inform us in our moment-to-moment lives and our decisions. So with that, what we are looking at today primarily are the varieties of karma, specifically in terms of the courses of karma. This is a very, very traditional teaching taught and found in the very early Abhidhamma Kosha and the early Abhidhamma, both in the in every Buddhist tradition. So one of the aspects of this, and I'm going to actually slightly jump ahead because it's relevant, is to consider how karma is divided. So last week, mainly, I was talking primarily about how there is karma in terms of our actions, physics, but also then the socio-political, social aspects of how what we do affects the people around us, and also how it affects our minds internally. So these three really primarily, regardless of looking into the future, are very, very powerful and very easy for us to see if we are willing to look at that. So we can see quite, or are able to see, or if we observe, how when we begin to develop a cycle of mental behavior, that can become quite strong and overwhelming, and we find ourselves almost or often actually caught in a compulsion or compulsive behavior, which we would want to avoid. So these sorts of things are very, very deep set psychologically. And I'm not claiming to be a modern psychologist. This is from Buddha Dhamma point of view. And likewise, also we say the same with social activity in terms of the way that something that somebody does or we do has a cascading effect across the society and therefore across the world. And there are lots of examples, both in the East and the West, like for instance about, you know, the boss berates the employer, the employee goes home, and although it's normally a man, it could be a woman, and she beats the husband beats the child beats the dog, and everybody's sort of, you know, this sort of idea is well known. So then on these sort of things, we also can say, sometimes it's actually easier for us to recognize the power of karma in terms of good and bad, or positive and negative, in terms of how we have been affected, rather than necessarily what we, or it helps us to see why we could or could not change, or why we should or should not change, not because Ben says it or Buddha says it or anything, but from our own personal experience. So for instance, if we think even within our families, and we go through our family, our own lives, we'll see there are times when we have really suffered. So on this basis, we can see where we've suffered because of a sense of injustice, a sense of resentment, a sense of having our expectations or our trust misplaced. So often this is with parents or with our siblings or our partners, but also with extended into work and elsewhere, where we suddenly we discover or find out that something that we thought we could trust, we could no longer trust. And at that moment, there's a huge degree of suffering, and often rage, and often this sense of injustice, which sometimes wakens much later on from the event. We might not even recognize it in the moment, and later on we then see it clearly, and then there's this sort of can be a very, very strong response, emotional and mental response to what's happening. So in those situations, we can see that the behavior, or certainly our perception of that behavior, has been very, very damaging, right? So one of the things where this is often very easy to see is where violence, okay, even small, low-scale violence can very easily cause a great deal of distress, even if there's not much intent present. But at the same time, we can also see it with lies. So when we feel that we've been deceived sort of systemically over a period of time, or even just occasionally in a way about something from somebody who we deeply trusted not to say these sorts of things, let alone theft or death or these other things that could happen. So, the more dramatic events that take place. So in these sorts of ways, we can see, again, these aggressors as actually as teachers for us in terms of what not to do. Yeah. So that's quite a hard step initially, but the idea is to say, let's try to find, not try to cover it up, not try to deny it, not try to repress or to unrelate to it, but to try to find a way of emotionally containing our responses in a way which is actually empowering. So one of the aspects of this negative, these responses of where we've been involved in negative action, but also this happens, of course, we can possibly recognize when we ourselves have been the aggressors, is now where was I? So is to do with the idea of saying, I shouldn't be necessarily passive in the situation, right? So given an example of, like, let's say if I'm robbed, or subject to other things that are outside of my control in terms of the event. And yet at the same time, it's like saying, well, I'm a Buddhist, I can let it go. So, it's all just stuff, never mind. But at the same time, there's going to be some sense of hurt, right? Because there's something very, very invasive about burglary or theft. So in these sorts of situations, we could argue to say, well, one way is, let it go. Another way is to say, well, actually, I need to be able to take some sort of degree of responsibility for ensuring that this doesn't happen in the future. And this means that we need to be careful about our response, our emotional response. One way is to sort of, a very typical sort of a natural biological response is to want to punish. Yeah. So this, in a sense, is actually malice. So it's a sort of a malicious intent to cause harm or to see somebody being harmed, because we have felt that harm ourselves. We felt punished by, inadvertently possibly punished by a person, and therefore we want to retaliate. Eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth, pound of flesh sort of stuff. And the point about that is to say, well, we can do that, but all we're doing is continuing on this cycle of violence or a cycle of suffering, right? We're not stopping it. We're just taking part in it. And therefore, one of the aspects of that is to think carefully about saying how we need to unpack it a bit and to recognize that what we really want to do through kindness is legitimate kindness, is to help the aggressor not be able to do that anymore. So if we just sit back and say, oh, well, I'm being a Buddhist and la la la, in a sense, one's being complicit with the behavior of the aggressor, right? One is actually allowing them to continue. So we have quite an important role, is to say, no, I'm not going to step back and let the aggressor continue. So very, very easy to do. Sometimes painful, we can still feel hurt, but at the same time to actually stand up and say, no, this isn't right, I need to do something about it. This is sort of a little bit more responsible. But of course, to go to the police if we don't have evidence is just going to make more suffering. So it doesn't work. So we need to be clear about what we're able to do and how best to do it in accordance with the situation and circumstances. And sometimes we can do nothing anyway, right? But that sort of thing, possibly put up a note saying, you know, there's a burglar around, or whatever it happens to be. So those sorts of things are where we can actually recognize just the strength of behavior as it has affected us, or how we have possibly affected others. And then that helps guide us in terms of what sorts of things we want to restrain from taking part in. So when we're looking at this, and going back to last week, we were talking about karma and actions and activity. One of the distinctions I didn't make, but is going to become more relevant, especially in the next 2 weeks, is intentional action and unintentional action. So one of the aspects of this is to say that unintentional action also has consequences. If I inadvertently hurt a child while I'm driving, then of course there's huge numbers of consequences. But if I deliberately run over a child, there is a whole nother set of consequences which are far, far more dire. So these sorts of things are really important in terms of recognizing intentionality as a part of how karma expresses. And it's not the fact that it's saying, for instance, there are other things to take into consideration, which are covered in detail that I'm not going to talk about even in the Lam Rim, because there are so many different aspects to ethical behavior. But to do with, for instance, being responsible in terms of non-neglectful. So if, for instance, I sort of say, oh, it was an accident, I didn't even really bother to look, then this would be a mistake. And likewise, to do an accident when I'm drunk, similarly, this is just not being careful, it's not being correct. So our degree of vigilance and mindfulness is absolutely relevant to our actions. And most of the time I'm using very, very coarse examples like killing or hurting a child, but there are many of these are very, very subtle. And even still, we need to be very careful at examining our sustaining a mindfulness and vigilance of behavior in terms of appropriateness in the moment. So one of the things, of course, is to say that what we want to do is to look actually what's happening right now. This is the mindfulness we're talking about, not in terms of trying to keep calm, but trying to be aware of where our mind is in terms of preventing the causing of harm, and possibly helping to provide happiness or to sustain happiness. So this, one of the aspects of this thing to do with like lying, stealing, killing, and so on, is that if we want to really unpack again what ahimsa, non-harm, is about, which is one of the key aspects of the moral foundations within, the ethical foundations within Buddhism, not the only one, but one of the key ones to consider, is disempowerment. So when we lie to somebody, we are disempowering them, we're preventing them from being able to come to their own mind or their own response to something where we're actually holding back. And likewise, obviously, if we're killing, we've disempowered them in the most ultimate sense. But there are other things, such as the way in which we may slander or gossip or take part in these other activities, which will go into some detail, which is primarily disempowering. So suffering isn't just about violence. It's not just about bad words or being nasty. It is also about the idea of reducing or relinquishing somebody's ability to understand or to feel empowered by or to feel a part of the responsibility that's happening at the moment. So consent, again, is one of these aspects in terms of, for instance, taking part in something like sex. Then consent is absolutely critical. Without it, the individuals are disempowered. And we don't need to talk about it just in terms of these big coarse things. It's also true in the very, very small. So a part of that then is to say, well, what is good, what is bad? And in a simple sense is those actions, which I think I said before, those actions or those activities which are empowering, and bring joy or reduce suffering are good, and those which are disempowering, cause suffering, or prevent enlightening activity, in terms of prevent the ability to develop the causes of joy. This is bad. This is the meaning of doing good and not doing bad. So evil and sin and these sorts of words are used, but they're very poor translations, because sin sort of implies some sort of judgment from God, which is just not relevant in the context. So we do have to be a bit careful about some of the words used, and I do sometimes in translations that I'm reading, these words are used, and I sometimes read them out, but that's not to mean that we really accept this sort of thing. So what we're going to now be concentrating on in this chapter primarily is to do with intentional activity, not non-intentional activity. So again, part of this is to remember that when we are intentional, when we intend to do something, then the effect is much stronger. When we are intending to do it and we have absolutely we're not even aware that we're doing it. Just because we're intending to do it doesn't necessarily mean that we're aware of what it is that we're really doing, because we haven't recognized it. So I might feel like that punishing people is good, right? That they need to be punished, and or I might feel very happy about the fact that the Ukrainians have killed a whole lot of Russians. But when we actually look at that, what that means is we're finding joy in the killing, or we're finding a justification for punishment. So these sorts of things have an underlying mistaken view, and it's very, very easy for us to do that. It doesn't matter, even after decades of practice, we can still very easily make these mistakes. So we need to be aware of very carefully. We need to think for ourselves and think carefully about how we, what makes something good, what makes something bad, how we need to respond accordingly. And the Dharma helps, Buddha Dharma, reading the sutras helps, but also then we need to link to our own experience and our own understanding. And one of the difficulties or the challenges is that we can find ourselves using rather specious justifications for our behaviors. And this, in a sense, is a dishonesty and therefore a disempowerment towards ourselves. And empowerment is really a lot of what our practice is about, is to provide that empowerment. So back to what we're talking about. So one of the things the Buddha talks about are the 10 paths of action, also known as the 10 courses of action, the 10 virtues, the 10 non-virtues. And these aren't really an exclusive list or a specific list. They were mentioned in sutra, both in very, very old sutra, but also in modern, in Mahayana sutra, as being a very good way of being able to remember what we should not, or what we should be doing. And these are really divided into those actions which are physical, those which are speech-based, and those which are mental. And he says, Je Rinpoche takes from the Treasury of Knowledge, which is an early Mahayana Abhidharma, that that Buddha has mentioned in many sutras, that these paths of action, or these courses of karma, and virtuous, non-virtuous, are 10. So this is him saying this is where it comes from. And there are other places, like from the Vinaya exegesis of the discipline. If you practice these 3 paths of action, guarding your speech, restraining mentally, and not committing physical non-virtue, then you will achieve the path that is being taught by Buddha. So he says knowing them is one thing, understanding them and actually using them to inform us from moment to moment is what we're working to, right? So we need to develop that commitment of restraint. Now, when they're normally taught, they're taught in the negative sense in terms of what we should not do. But the restraint of those itself is the good action, and restraint is seen as as a deliberate action. So when we are presented with an opportunity that would allow for us to take part in that, and we say no, then this is when our practice really kicks in. And this is good karma. This is very, very powerful and good practice. But at the same time, actually, there are the flip side, the positive aspects, which we can talk about. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about how they have a reverse side too. And again, Je Rinpoche cites the questions of the King Nagas of the Ocean Sutra, and it says, what I've called the virtues. This is Buddha speaking to the King of the Nagas. Are the taproots of the perfections of all deities and humans. They are the taproots of the enlightenment of Sravaka Buddhas and Pratyeka Buddhas. They are the taproots of the unexcelled perfect enlightenment of the Bodhisattva. And what are these taproots? They are the 10 virtuous actions. So again, he then is rather nice. He says, for example, Lord of Nagas, all the villages, the cities, the municipalities, the districts, the countries, the king's palaces, all grass, all bushes, all medicinal herbs, trees, all the fruits of labor, all stocks of seeds, the growth of all harvests, their ploughing, the harrowing, their production, everything rests on the earth. Their source is the earth. And likewise, O King Lord of Nagas, these paths of the 10 virtuous actions are the sources of high rebirth, of attaining the goal of virtuous practices of the learners, of the Shravakas, and also those with no more to learn, arahats, of the enlightenment of a pratyeka, the solitary realizer, of all the bodhisattva deeds, and all of the qualities of a Buddha. So he's making it pretty clear here that the 10 virtuous actions lie primarily at the foundation of our understanding of our practice, which is probably not too surprising. And Chandrakirti, who is quoted is from wisdom tradition in the Prasnapada, he summarized the significance of this taken from the Sutra of the 10 Levels. He says, for ordinary beings, as most of us, those born from the Buddha's speech, which is higher beings, practitioners, those whose natures are certain as self-enlightened, the pratyekas, all conquerors' children, all the bodhisattvas, in other words, everybody. There are no causes of certain goodness or high status apart from ethical discipline. In fact, we see ethical discipline, of course, is the first step in terms of the development of enlightenment on the 3 higher trainings. Ethical discipline is what we need to establish first. And the normal way in which we do this is through recognizing and understanding the power of how karma works. And this is why I said last week that karma really is primarily the most important view for us to establish, because without it, our ethical behavior will be insubstantial. It won't be well-founded, well substantiated. So we need to really think very carefully about this. And Je Rinpoche says then we need to guard our ethical discipline by maintaining a sense of restraint, or as I said, vigilance. He said that unfortunately there are those who have no restraint in terms of their behavior, and not even with a single aspect of their of ethical discipline. And they say, I'm a practitioner of the Mahayana. And he said, this is so sad. This is just not right at all. And he then quotes the Sutra of Je Tsongkhapa as a Mahayana Sutra. By means of the 10 paths, you become a Buddha. However, there are those who, as long as they live, do not even minimally maintain a single path of virtuous action, but they say things like, I am a Mahayana practitioner. I seek unexcelled perfect enlightenment. I am a bodhisattva. And such people are great hypocrites and liars. They deceive the world in the presence of the Buddha, and they preach nihilism. When they die, they seem confused and will fall. So the point about this is to say is that we may have wonderful philosophical views about enlightenment. We may have wonderful understandings of the way in which the sutras have been developed. We might have a very, very eloquent ability to talk about a Buddha's life, or all the interesting complexities of any of the various subjects or topics of Buddha Dhamma, or anything else. But if we don't actually live our lives moment to moment informed by our ethical practice, there's really not much there. Yep. So this is, in a sense, where we have to start from. Ethics, as a part of the three higher trainings, is much greater than, and covers much more base than just the 10 non-virtuous actions. But as I said before, these provide us with a basic format for how we begin to structure and, in a sense, minimally sustain some form of ethical environment. And Je Rinpoche later on, he'll say, this is, if you're saying, well, I didn't talk about the refuge precepts, these are they. We don't need to go any further than this, really, in one sense. But I will go into that a bit later. So then he said, okay, well, we've talked about them and how great they are and so on. So what are they? And again, the first is the coarsest, if you like, in terms of subject, which is killing. So what he does is he then says, there are all sorts of things that actually that affect the power of, or the destructiveness of the karma of killing. And he goes through this in a sort of categorical way, and I'm going to do a sort of a briefer cover of this, not because I think you don't need to know it, but I think really in the end, I doubt that any of us present have the intention to go around killing. So I think that's sort of something we need to consider. Anyway, the basis of killing is a being who is alive. In other words, the required basis for a killing is to have a being who's alive. We can't kill a brick and expect huge karmic consequences, even if we have a strong intention to kill a brick. There are four types of perception about this, and again, I'm going to do this a little bit for the first, but not for all of them. Perceiving a living being, in other words, the basis of the killing, to be living, to be a living being. Perceiving we might perceive a living being to not be a living being. So he's going through this from a logical sort of progression, perceiving what is not living being a not living being, and perceiving what is not living to be a living being. And he says it's only, obviously, of these four, which is a sort of a complete exclusive list, is only when we have the perceptions that a living being is living, and we have perception that a not living being is not living, are accurate perceptions, and therefore inaccurate perceptions are not valid, and obviously we can't kill a non-living being. So what he's saying is when we perceive a living being as a living being, then there's very little doubt about whether or not they're eligible for us to be involved in a strong karmic action. So I said I won't go into this, and for each one of these, then there might be a specific motivation, such as I might be, and this is sort of a specialized motivation, such as I might plan to kill only somebody who's called Devadatta, somebody I know who's called Devadatta. And then against that, I commit murder However, I may have got the person wrong, and I've actually killed Jnana Datta instead of Devadatta. So in that case, the killing, there's no doubt, of course, that the effect is very strong in terms of the fact that I've committed murder, I've committed intentional murder, but it's not as strong as if I've killed the subject I actually aimed at. It's actually very similar to sort of British law, weirdly, but these are the sorts of things. It's still death, it's still murder. So he's saying, but however, if my intent to kill is general, in other words, I just want to kill, then it doesn't matter. The effect it covers across whoever it is who is killed by it. He says the affliction is any of the mental poisons, any of the afflictions are available to us. We can kill from ignorance. We can kill from attachment. We can kill from malice. And but the motivation is the intention. What motivates is the intention to actually kill. It makes no difference at all whether or not I actually commit the killing myself, or if I've paid or caused somebody else to do it on my behalf. And the nature of this is done in many different ways. And he says, you know, if you use a poison or weapon or whatever. So, you know, a gun, it doesn't matter, it's not important. And the culmination, and this is the word culmination, is how the killing is actually completed, is the death of another on account of what I've done, either at the moment in which it happened, at the moment in time, or subsequently at a subsequent point of time, or even, yeah. So one of the aspects of this is primarily to say that, in fact, the intentional aspect of it is extremely important. Being able to recognize what it is extremely important. Recognizing that I've done it or I've completed it is important. And also, which is not mentioned here, but is mentioned elsewhere, being content with or feeling satisfaction about that action is extremely and dramatically creates a strength or power to our mental, our social, and physical world. In terms of the effect it has, is far, far more consequential. So again, I said I don't really want to go through these particularly, but the next is stealing. Stealing again is something that we all know. Robbing, I talked about earlier on. We're sort of aware of the normal core sense of stealing. He does talk about some of the variations which are relevant, and in fact there's a Theravadan who's written quite a lot on stealing, and he talks about all the modern ways in which stealing can take place, such as through internet fraud or through telephone fraud and so on, and he says all of these are obviously stealing. And he says, and Je Rinpoche concurs, he says robbing by force or by theft or by subterfuge, they're the same, it doesn't matter. It says when you engage in deceit about debts or trusts, or take what's not given by other deceitful means, it doesn't matter whether you take it for your sake or for others' sakes, or to harm others. In the end, it's stealing, right? So essentially, the culmination, he says, a compendium of determinations. It says, you know, it's moving the object to another location. He says, well, this is not actually really very good. As Jeremy says, you know, there are plenty of cases which are incompatible with the meaning, but meets the intent. In other words, you can steal things which are immaterial that aren't necessarily moved to another location. You can steal things which are material and they haven't moved at all. It's just a transfer of ownership, like a house, right? You can steal a house, literally steal a house by taking the deeds. You're not moving it to another location. So he says, really, in the end, we have to remember this as an illustration. And he says his example is fields. We can steal fields, we can steal land, and quite clearly, it's not movable in that sense. Sexual misconduct. So these are the three physical ones. And sexual misconduct, there's a vast amount of specific details on all the different things that we shouldn't be doing. I want to primarily sort of spare us from going through all of these things, mainly because I don't think any of them are really going to be relevant to those of us present. If we want to know, we can find the details in so many different places. But some of the things I think are absolutely relevant, obviously, are to do with recognizing and establishing behavior, sexual behavior, which involves fully informed consent of all people involved. And that would mean, if we're talking about people involved, such as a parent with children, the children and the spouses are a part of the required consent. So it really does require a degree of consent in a larger group than just the people involved. And likewise, even with this, in a sense, informed consent means that people who are able to, who are not in a vulnerable situation, who are able to know what it is that they're consenting to, is absolutely relevant. And if we're talking about people within a family, then the family is a part of that consent group. And we can see it, although it sounds very much more restrictive than sort of modern sort of cultural norms. In one sense, what we're saying is, if a friend of mine has, or let's say I have had sex with somebody, even though some people consented and others haven't, but they, you know, like the family or the grandmother or their children or whoever it happens to be, they're like, you know, oh, you know, they feel very upset that this has happened, then this is suffering. There's some level of betrayal that's taken place. So it's this sort of thing, again, that we're looking at, which is, it's often easier to recognize in terms of the experiences that we've had, rather than it is in terms of what it is that we might do based on theory. He also then says, and importantly, he says, you know, we also got to remember the path of enlightenment regarding our behaviors. And this is also, although he talks about this within sex, is also true with killing and stealing, is that we really don't want to be doing these sorts of things close to dharma centers or within monasteries or in temples and so on. It's just not appropriate for this sort of behavior to take place. And he gives a list such as where there are residences or stupas, images. So for instance, having tankas or posters of Buddha in our bedroom is really not good. If we want to, if we live in a very small space, then it's better really to cover or use a cover while we are doing what we want to do in bed. And then we can sort of save ourselves from this sort of problem. So primarily this purpose is about sustaining respect for Buddha and Buddha Dharma, and recognizing that sort of being, having these images while we're engaging in sex is not really appropriate. It's not good for our mind. So these are primarily these three three physical non-virtuous actions. Again, obviously, the positive, the virtuous actions that are affected by the body are restraining from killing, restraining from stealing, and restraining from sexual misconduct. And again, if we want to look at that in terms of positive actions, certainly being able to provide life or help assist with life, to help those who are likely to be killed. This is a very good opportunity for us to develop a positive virtuous action, and similar. So then lying is one of those things that actually, I think probably one of the first sort of heartbreaks we have as children is when we experience the lie. We may have been lying, we may have even lied ourselves without necessarily realizing it, but there comes a point when we experience the effect of the lie. and there's a sort of outrage. It's like, this, my world is sort of broken apart by it. And this is obviously, this is a sense of saying what I thought was there is no longer there. And while you could argue, well, that's quite enlightening, unfortunately, what we really notice is that there is a lack of a sense of total disempowerment, right? So one of the aspects of this is really quite important, is there are lots of people who say, well, white lies are fine. White lies are necessary. White lies are how the world works. And yes, it is true. But at the same time, it's like saying, okay, well, how can we tell whether or not this is a white lie, or whether it's not, it's a speciously white. I want it to be white, but it's not really white at all. And this really primarily is considering autonomy. So when we might have a very, very good intention of not wanting to cause harm, or let's say preventing somebody from feeling miserable about something, so we tell them an easy lie, and then at the same time, what happens is we're actually preventing them from being able to emotionally engage in that situation with your assistance. So in that sense, it's like saying, maybe it's actually better for me to provide the truth in a way which is where I meet the needs of the person who I would otherwise lie to. So those sorts of things are, clearly in terms of, if you're in a hospital, there's been a cultural change where doctors used to say, no, you're fine. No, they never say that anymore. And this is an example where there's a recognition that actually these white lies are not really necessarily beneficial. So he says, again, and it's sort of relevant, is the culmination is somebody else believing you, somebody else actually, the subject of the lie being the object of the lie, having been persuaded or being unpersuaded. Now, inaction in terms of not speaking is mentioned, or through using a misleading gesture. So it's not like we can sort of say, somebody says, have you been eating the biscuits? And I say, it's like, yeah, well, if I have been eating the biscuits and they're persuaded that I haven't because of my gesture, this is a lie, right? So it's not like there's a sort of a trick around it. Yeah, that's all. Some of this is sort of quite obvious, but the point is, it's just trying to be clear. Some of the students for this were really quite young, and they wanted to have a very clear idea about what this was. So then we have divisive speech. And divisive speech is also where we wish to cause division, or where we want to sustain division. And this is primarily, is often also includes slander, because when we criticize somebody, when we slander somebody, when we say things about how bad they are, or we say, oh, they're no good or whatever, what we're doing is we're creating a division between the person we're speaking to and the person we're speaking about. So this is a part of the same sort of thing. But also it's where we have maybe two people who are getting on together, and we find ways of manipulating situations is normally taught within speech, but again, speech can be through gesture, or it can be through inaction or non-saying something, where we want to separate them and create conflict within them, right? And create a difference of opinion about them. And this is where we are beginning to sort of spread malicious gossip to cause trouble, in order to deliberately meet not necessarily our aims, anybody's aims, but where we're causing trouble. There is divisive speech. Most of us have felt the hurt of divisive speech. We know what it looks like. right? So the idea is to say, again, what can we do to prevent this from taking place in the future as well? So, but also what we should not be doing, and we need to be very, very careful about that. So again, it's like saying when our mouths open, all sorts of stuff comes out. We need to be clear that what's coming out is not a deceit, is not divisive, not offensive. We'll do the next two. We've still got two to go. So again, for those who are already divided, when we actually just carry on feeding that fire, that's still divisive speech. It's basically not helping. And it doesn't matter. We might be pleasant. We might say very pleasant things. We might appear to be being very honest. The intention and the response of division is what matters, not necessarily how we do it or the way in which we do it. We might sound completely reasonable. In fact, that's sometimes how powerful it is. But at the end, we're causing a huge amount of suffering. So one of the dangers of when we're in a position of authority and somebody says, you know, like for instance, giving a refuge, is it's very, very important for us to be extremely clear and honest and objective. Sometimes if we're unable to be objective because we have so much fury or whatever, some difficult trouble with it, it's better for us to try to keep, and I guess we used to say zip lip, you know, not necessarily say nothing, but at the same time be aware that maybe we're not the best person to be talking about in this situation, to recuse ourselves as much as we're able without allowing this problem to continue. So being able to be honest and clear and non-divisive, sometimes it's better for us to say, look, I've got a difficult relationship with this person. Maybe I'm not the best person for you to ask about, right? So, you know, it's I have my own luggage, right? So this is a good way of being able to approach these difficult situations. Okay, so offensive speech is when we actually is specifically slander in this sense, and also saying something that would is hostile. So whereas divisive is primarily the effect is splitting, and I said you can be nice, but offensive is actually a direct hostile stuff. And again, it doesn't need to be coming across hostile. It can be coming across very calm and very reasonable. But the effect is, in the end, what you're doing is diminishing or saying stuff that somebody would would be harmed by. Now you could argue and say, well, Ben, earlier on you said, you know, if I go around telling somebody, you know, such and such has been involved in domestic abuse, and it's like saying, well, yeah, sure, but in the end, what I'm trying to do is to help them. We need to find a way of being able to move forward. So it's not as if it's necessarily easy. The way in which we do it and the motive with which we do it is absolutely irrelevant. If I have a motive which is I want them punished or I want them hurt, it's best to be really clear about that fact in yourself, because it's going to steer, it's going to gear everything we do in a way which is going to be distorted. And it's very hard for us to be able to sustain impartiality, right? If we can, or we're in a situation where we're sure, and I've seen plenty of examples, I've taken part in examples where I thought I was being objective, and actually later on I thought about it, it's like, well, I wasn't really very objective at all. I wasn't nearly as impartial as I could have been. Then one needs to think really carefully about how able we are to be able to express ourselves in these situations. But generally, in terms of honest, open intent, if the offensive speech is made to the purpose that actually trouble is caused, then this is offensive. Now, the thing is also, and one needs to be a bit careful about this, is that we don't want to be stuck in a position where somebody claims to be offended by you saying something which is meant in an inoffensive way. And we are surrounded in situations where there are people who appear to be very easily offended by anything that goes outside of their own worldview. So in those situations, the best thing to do is to be aware of as much as we can worldview, but we are not held by their their sense of offense. If our intent is honestly compassionate and open, and they take offense at this point of our saying something, we can definitely, without any hesitation, apologize for having been instrumental in any suffering, which certainly was not the intent, we're being honest, right? But at the same time, it also, we can reinforce it and say, okay, how could I improve? What is it that I said that how could I have become better? And then it's like saying, okay, well, and they might say, well, it's because you're Buddhist. Then it's like, well, okay, I'm not sure that I'm necessarily going to have to be able to change that. So on our side, again, we need to be aware of what is disempowering and how some people will express a sense of disempowerment even when there's not really much there to it. So we have to be a bit aware, especially in the modern world, as speech is very, very powerful and used in many different ways, which is not necessarily covered in the Lamrim. But we need to be aware of what we're doing in terms of our responsibility, in terms of our compassion and our loving kindness, and our sense of the ethical base of certainly of non-harm, of trying to benefit, of being reasonable, and being and acting appropriately. Senseless speech is the fourth of the four actions, paths of karma in terms of speech. And here he talks a lot about sort of time wasting, really, and being sort of silly, really. He sort of says primarily doing things which are completely meaningless, sort of like wailing or sort of being over playful or attempting to be clowning around. But I think really, or like being drunk or like a lunatic. Now, I know of lamas, teachers, who actually have engaged in all sorts of strange behaviors, such as pretending to be monkeys and so on like this. And one could argue and say, well, how is this not senseless speech or senseless behavior? And there are lots of lamas who are very well known for their humor and acting in humorous ways. And you say, well, okay, I mean, this is like stand-up comedy, and it's like saying, okay, but primarily, if our intent again is to be meaningful, then we look at that rather than we look at the meaninglessness. And again, actually, and far more importantly, is gossip. So Geshe wouldn't really talk about the clowning around as being specifically idle gossip, although Lama Tsongkhapa does. He would say primarily it's spending a lot of time just talking about the news, or like what's happening around the corner, and how sort of curtain twitching. Oh, what he's done that, and all of that sort of stuff. So that sort of stuff is basically senseless speech. It has no value, and worse, can lead to sort of gossip, and gossip which itself then through the gossip engine becomes slanderous, becomes offensive becomes divisive. Even if the intent wasn't, one of the dangers of this sort of stuff is that actually we might even be talking nicely about people and say, oh, did you hear about this and about that? But by talking about them, they can find themselves feeling rather disempowered by what's going on or what's being talked about without their involvement. So these sorts of things where we're gossiping or just getting involved in, oh, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? In the end is pretty senseless. Now, one of the areas where we have to be aware of that's mentioned by Geshe-la and other people is things like politics. So there's social and also sort of state politics, and to a degree, there's some benefit to this, and in terms of the fact that if it helps us think about how best to act, in other words, we look at it in terms of an ethical decisions we need to make, then there's some benefit to it. If we're talking about it and we actually have no control over it, it makes no difference to us whatsoever, then there's no benefit there, right? So we need to be aware of what it is we're thinking and how we're thinking about that. Again, he also talks about irreligious speech and behaving inappropriately. So, for instance, in a serious religious ceremony, to start making a raucous laughing or giggling, which I've done, and I feel some intent not to do that again. This sort of thing is like causes hurt. Actually, causes hurt for those people who are taking their spiritual path seriously. So we should be taking our spiritual path seriously. We're trying to be sincere. So if we start messing around or affecting other people's spiritual path, then this is quite clearly not good. So these 7, right? We're now done 7. We've covered the 3 sort of non-virtues of the body, and then 4 of the speech. Is then there are these ones here. They're all actual direct physical actions, and they're accompanied with strong motives. And then the next 3 really are indicative of the afflictions and the power of the afflictions, and they themselves aren't necessarily actions as much as they are the basis from which actions arise. And unlike, for instance, killing, stealing, and so on, these ones, like, for instance, covetousness, can have all sorts of various different behaviors in terms of activities or actions with speech and body, which are inappropriate. So they're far broader sense of what we shouldn't do. Now, and also restraining is what we should do. Now, of those, there are 3 mentioned here. There are generally 10 afflictions altogether that are spoken most clearly. And of those 10, Lord Buddha chose these specific 3. So we cover the 10 afflictions in the middle scope. So not that far away, actually. But here what we're talking is just about 3. And the 3 are covetousness. Covetousness is a word I really didn't know. When I started at Lam Rim, it was like, what's covetousness? And also because I didn't have a strong, maybe because I didn't have a strong Christian background, so coveting thy neighbor's wife was sort of, I don't even know what that means, right? So primarily it's a grasping attitude of wanting something that isn't mine. Right, so primarily it's like saying, I want his wealth or her wealth. I want her position. I want to like empire building is all about covetousness. I want to take on this one and this one and this one. I want to build my empire. Right, a power politics is covetousness. Right, so not just wealth and possessions, but also position, power, and so on. Normally the motivation, and it can be also fame. So it's not just even a physical or material objects. It's anything. It's like, I want this, I want that. I want to make it mine, about this sort of idea. And Asanga says, you know, having some of the ways in which we can identify covetousness is this having a mind that's very attached to my own resources, to my own things, both, again, not just material, but also my reputation or my fame or whatever it happens to be, or my infamy even, I don't know. Having a mind of attachment that wants to accumulate. I want more and more and more. I'm trying to invest in more and more. Having a mind of longing due to comprehending or experiencing the good things of others, their wealth. So seeing what others have and feeling, I want that. I'm not happy enough with what I've got. I want more. I want to be rich. I want to be a trillionaire. You know. So this sort of what's very strange, of course, is that you find in certain Western cultures, including, I'd say, a lot of where we currently are, this covetousness is considered to be a great thing, right? You know, it's like, oh yeah, this is personal ambition. Wow, you know, look at him go. He's really driven for, you know, for these things. And it's like within a Buddhist context, this is like an affliction of the worst sort, right? There's only one of three that are, you know, and it's considered to be seriously damaging. So an envious mind, having an envious mind, thinking that, you know, whatever is somebody else's, it should be mine. I've got a right to this. They've got it. I've got a right to it too, right? This sort of enviousness. And he says, lastly, is this, what we find is a sort of shamelessness because we want it so much, we feel justified in our behaviors. As soon as we feel that justification, it's right for me to do this, it's okay for me to do this. This is what Je Rinpoche calls shamelessness, because we are willing to go out and grab or whatever techniques we want to use to take power and to take on these things which are not mine. So these driving forces primarily are the underlying action of the underlying action, the underlying basis of actions called covetousness. He gives some examples. So I'm going to use the examples. They're now a little bit out of date, or possibly not, but in my life they're out of date because I don't know anyone who really keeps servants or anything. But I for the sake of not just listening to Ben hesitate and stumble his way through these things, I'll share them with you. So he says, for instance, the thought, oh, how nice it would be if the master of the house were to become my servant and things could go be how I would wish them. So I think from this we can probably gather that the person who's thinking this is a servant within a house. And also, I'm not just interested in if I were the master of the husband, but also I could have his wife and his children and all of his possessions, such as the food and so on. Oh, nice it would be if others knew me to have all these wonderful qualities as being dispassionate or retiring, persevering and learned and generous, right? So these, not necessarily just in tied of his boss, but as saying that my intention is to develop a reputation, right? Like others have. How nice it would be if the kings and ministers and all the different types of the followers of the Buddha were to respect me and give me whatever I needed in terms of necessities of food and clothing and wealth and so on, right? May I be respected by the Buddhist community. These sorts of things, right? They seem or can often appear good, but actually they're built in covetousness. They're covered in covetousness. Developing desire. Oh, may I be reborn in the future as a deity and enjoy all the lovely partying that goes on there. Or it sort of, although he says, you know, I be reborn in the worlds of Vishnu as a deity in the heaven of controlling others' emanations, which is the highest heaven of the divine regions of the desire realm. This is basically like saying, I want to be in Hollywood. I want to be it's like I want to have the luxury of being an oligarch or a Hollywood star, right? This is my desire. And having a desire also for the possessions of parents, of our children, our partners, and the like, or and possession also means control over, not necessarily just having it. So this sort of thing is like, or the possessions of our fellow practitioners. Oh, I really like that Buddha, you know. So, oh, I really like that Buddha, you know. I know they're ill. When they die, maybe I can make sure they get it to me. This is really just covetousness, right? Very, very simply. So we have to be really careful. It's very easy. I do this, you know, we fall into these things where we make these mistakes, and we have to be very aware of what covetousness is and what it is not, so we can prevent ourselves from falling into these mindsets. Why? Because they're disempowering. Why? Because they create strife and trouble. They cause pain, and they cause pain and trouble to ourselves. Right? We're trying to free ourselves from this covetousness, from this me, my, right? We're trying to break that. That's our whole purpose. So the idea is to not think about what I need, it's what everybody needs, right? So in that sense, it's like, come on now, this is rubbish. Yeah. We're trying hard to see, you know, rubbish thought, rubbish mind. Malice, right? Number 9, malice. Again, a word I wasn't very familiar with, because I understood sort of hatred or whatever, malice. So he said this is very similar to the, in terms of the perception, the afflictions are very similar to that of offensive speech, creating harm, deliberately wishing to cause harm. And he says, you know, again, using examples, how nice it would be if they were dead, right? Or if they're imprisoned, or if they were ruined or punished, either naturally or through officials or through another person or whatever. I don't need to do it. Just having the thought, you know, you know, that sense, right, of, you know, oh, they deserve to be punished, you know, bastards or whatever it happens to be, right? They get what they deserve. That's mind. That mind is malice. And then the culmination of all of the mental covetousness and malice and so on is actually doing something about it, right? But in terms of and recognizing that this mind of wanting to cause harm, of harmfulness, is not necessarily directed. It's a general state where we dwell in this unaddressed sense of and likewise, I'm not sure is a word, but I hope you sort of recognize what I'm trying to say, right? That not just playfully, actually meaningfully, you know, really wanting to harm, likewise, really wanting to grasp. These are what we're talking about, and they then manifest again and again in our behaviors. So again, he says that the attitudes, so some of the ways in which we can recognize this is through an attitude of hostility, of reifying this, and actually sort of feeling that these things really deserve being destroyed, more beings, you know, recognizing, and also this is saying they cause me trouble, rather than recognizing actually it's not so simple as that. So when we reify, we're like saying that's the problem. There's the problem. That's the problem. And when we do that, we're limiting our perspective on the world to saying that this is the only way in which this can be. You know, this is the truth. This is the only truth. They caused this. They're the fault. They're the ones who made the problem. I want them dead, right, or hurt. And again, also is an intolerant or an impatient attitude. Impatient, not in terms of waiting for a bus, as much as a feeling aggressed by, unhappy with, agitated by, intolerant of, and of those who are causing our suffering. So this is when, for instance, when we recognize that when we find it difficult, when we feel we are being harmed, or we recognize we're being harmed, for us to be agitated by that and turn it back, which is what I was talking about earlier on, that is a sign that there's still malice within us. right? There's an anger there. Anger often means a sort of a rage, but we're not really talking about that. We're talking about an intent, wanting to harm. Yeah, that sort of not necessarily with a dagger. I keep on doing this like some sort of Hitchcock film, but it's not necessarily like that. It's like, they need to be told off. They need to be punished. They need to be, they need to be imprisoned. Those sorts of things we have to be very, very careful of. So again, another sign of this malice is there's a resentful attitude that's built up from an improper attention to and mindfulness of the causes of our anger. We're not willing. We resent the idea that our anger is not justified, or that we have any control over it, or that we want to do anything about it. This is the point where we actually feel like when somebody says, you can change your mind, they're like, I don't want to change. What are you telling me to change my mind all the time for? This sort of thing is like a sign of malice. So we need to be aware of the fact that as we are responding to these situations, we need to think, well, okay, this is not necessarily the right person to say this to me, but at the end, are they right? Possibly, yeah. Maybe I do need to change my mind a little bit. Maybe it is good for me to try to let go of some of this malice. Do I even know what it looks like? Can I recognize it yet? Can I see it yet? And that point is like saying, well, maybe it's there and I'm not really recognizing it. So we have to be aware of or reflective of the fact that we can do something with that. We can change it. We have to recognize it before we even can do anything, right? So those sorts of things are important to us. And again, he says, Je Rinpoche is saying, we need to have this lack of shame that's dominated by our malice, oblivious about it being there, and oblivious about any determination to free ourselves from it. We feel justified in it. Okay, so again, the problem, just like there is with covetousness, is this sense of justification, that it's okay, right? And this is what he means by shamelessness. Is no, it's good to be strong. It's good to be, good to put my foot down and be furious. It's like, yeah, it is good to be strong. It's not good to be to have this strength in a malicious way, right? Malice is no good. So these sorts of things are, and then he says, just some simple ones. These simple examples. Someone has harmed me, and that always harming me, therefore I can harm them back. And he said, this is, we do it all the time. You see children do it, we do it. It's like they hit me, so I'll hit them back, right? And it's only fair. Malice. Wrong views. So there's the 10th of the wrong views. And we've still got quite a way because we'll go into some detail, but I think what we'll do is we'll finish it at the end of wrong view, and then we'll carry on next week for the rest. Okay. So the wrong view are the basis of wrong view are existent objects or existent realities, and this is based on the idea of perceiving things to be true which are not true, perceiving things to be false which are true, right? And specifically, these wrong views, again, are the basis of inappropriate action. It's not as if they are focused on one specific action. They're not actions themselves. They lead to a whole panoply, a whole variety of all sorts of different mistaken actions which cause harm, cause disempowerment, lead us to harm ourselves, and they are based on some really clear sort of ideas. One of them, which I think is probably too antique for us to be able to relate to, is the idea that that there are no mothers or fathers. Yeah. So this is one that he mentions is a denial that there are mothers and fathers. I think because this is to do with the way in which one gets pregnant. this leads to the idea of saying that sort of, I don't know, there's no father. I just, just a baby popped out. This sort of thing. It's like it's no good. So there's a mistaken denial. If one knows, actually, one does believe in it, and one knows that there is a father, and this is a lie, not a wrong view. So again, he says denial of former and future lives. This is the idea of saying if we're convinced we don't actually have any evidence for it, but we are convinced there are no future and former lives, and we say no, there can't be. This doesn't exist. This is a mistake. And again, there are several others, and one of them being the mistake of denying existent objects, such as the enlightened beings or the enlightened the path to enlightenment. If we think there is no path to enlightenment, it's not available to us, we can actually end up. One of the things about Buddha's teachings is it can make us feel very despondent if we feel that there is no actual path, because a lot of the truths depend upon us also having faith in the Buddhist path. For example, if we meditate on the truth of suffering, the 8 types of suffering, the many different types of suffering there are, the first noble truth, but even though we let's say we can see that, but we don't see the cause of suffering, then we can feel, and if we don't believe in rebirth, then we might think, well, I may as well commit suicide. Right? Because, hey, all I've got is nothing, nasty, brutish, and short, right? What's the point? So in these senses, a nihilistic view in terms of the fact of a Buddhist nihilism, in terms of the fact that by denying rebirth and denying the cause of suffering, then there's no solution. We may as well we may as well top ourselves. So these sorts of things are really quite important in terms of establishing what truths are available, what paths are available to us against our truths. And within a Buddhist context, definitely we need to accept that Buddha taught the pathway to some sort of enlightenment. We might not accept all of it, but the idea that this certainly helps us in terms of overcoming suffering, or the causes of suffering in some sense or another, is absolutely relevant. And again, karma. So in terms of what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, if we deny that there are consequences to our effects, we'll do anything, right? We'll say it doesn't really matter, because in the end, nobody's harmed by it. Whatever I do, it just stands alone. It doesn't really affect the rest of the world, doesn't really affect my mind. I'm not really affected by it in any way. And therefore it has no real meaning on the universe. So we have to be very careful if we lose a sense of consequence of our behavior, then in this sense we've lost one of the primary ethical structures that provides us for reason to be responsible in terms of our behaviors. So in the Travakas, a famous group of Indian spiritual adherents, like 2,000 years ago, they supposedly they had this view that there is no karma, there's no correspondence of action and consequence at all, not in this life, not in the next life. And apparently they were well known for encouraging incest and all sorts of other behaviors. Now, whether it's true or not is difficult to say, but this is certainly this is certainly the reputation they developed because of this denial of consequence. So these sorts of things primarily is like saying, and again, if we don't recognize that we're mortal, we're closing ourselves off to truths. So what we're doing really in many ways is by not having these views, or not accepting these views, or not being able to recognize these views, which is sort of understandable if we're closed off, we are going to end up creating more suffering than good. We're going to end up creating all sorts of problems because we don't have any moral compass. Or if we do have a moral compass, it is likely to be skewed in many sorts of ways. So we have to be sort of aware of trying to develop some sense of correct view. And this is true, it doesn't have to be just Buddhism. Is it also within the constraints of different other spiritual practices, is to make sure that we actually have a very, very clear ethical boundaries to our behaviors. And then within that, we find that actually there's a vast number of commonalities anyway. So he then says, again, we're talking about the idea of in its expression, in its fullness, how to recognize it is sort of saying an attitude of confusion, not really understanding things very clearly, a violent attitude or sort of indulgent attitude due to delighting in things that we really, in terms of activities that we should not be engaging in. Continually operating in various different ways which don't really make any sense, because we keep on, for instance, if we keep on jumping from our sources of teachings, if we sort of, one day I want to be follow one tradition, another spiritual tradition, another way I want to spend, another day I say this, then in the end we end up really with nothing. We end up just being very confused. So this sort of hopping is a sign or a symptom of wrong view, or corresponds to wrong view. Having an attitude towards spiritual practices that we don't understand is a sign of wrong view. So, for instance, not recognizing why offerings are done, religious offerings are made, why gifts to the Buddha are made, why, let's say, burnt offering prayers, fire pujas, and so on, or pujas in general, mandala offerings. What these are about, we don't understand them. Rather than just say, I don't know what they're doing, but it's obviously some part of their spiritual path. Instead, we say, oh, that's just rubbish. That's a wrong view. That at the moment is a wrong view. So we have to be careful to say, okay, well, look, maybe I do have that attitude sometimes. I have to be very careful to allow myself to accept that I do have these attitudes, all of these attitudes. I'm working on these things. I need to be able to recognize that, be open to the idea that maybe I am like that. And then I can say, okay, then I can begin to address them. And what I'm looking to do is to come to a point where I can recognize it. We all have this thing of thinking, oh yeah, I'm doing great, I'm all right. And actually, if we sort of say, it's like, saying, I've had a problem, or I'm angry, I don't get angry anymore, I am no longer angry. As soon as we say that, we're opened up to the fact that we're no longer looking out for it, right? We're no longer allowing ourselves to be mindful of it. We're closing ourselves to the opportunity of being able to see it when it arises. It's often the case, for instance, if we've dealt with a traumatic relationship and we say, oh yeah, or I'm completely over her, or I'm over him, or whatever. It's like, really, how do you know that? How sure are you? Because what I see is, or what we can see is essentially a whole group of affiliated behaviors which imply that you're not over it, right? But we have to find this for ourselves. There's no good seeing it in others. We can see it in others. We need to be looking to ourselves and our behaviors and our minds, not other people. That's their problem. Our problem is us, right? And again, he talks about being shameless in terms of saying, it doesn't matter. It's all like all this stuff. It doesn't matter. These views, it doesn't matter. They're not important. I can make them up as I go along. Not important. So he says these five again is what makes it full-fledged series of behaviors. So these sorts of things are really primarily about saying how to begin to unpack and consider how to behave, right? We've touched 7 of the course actions in terms of body and speech. There are many, many different ones available for us to be involved in terms of activities. And he's talked of 3 of the afflictions in terms of the paths of action of mind. But there are, I think, 10 major afflictions that we can look at, like pride or arrogance, which are also, or doubt. These are all available to us. And instead, Buddha was like, I don't want to kill people off with lists. But there are actually, these things are very, very powerful and required to be thought of. And we need to, on our side, we need to be able to start thinking, I can relate to this, I need to do something about it. Okay? So there's definitely time for us to finish today. Just to dedicate the merit to saying, let's be good at, let's work on on accepting that we've got a journey to make, we've got work to do. We're never finished until we're Buddhas. I'm not a Buddha, so I've still got work to do. May I carry on my path, working on my path, taking refuge in the community of fellow spiritual practitioners, taking refuge in the Dharma and the Buddha as sources of guidance and also of assistance, and recognizing, for me, my part in this is to try to work hard on becoming a better person for the benefit of all beings. No, that's all I wish for. And so after that, let's just allow ourselves just to reside in peace for a minute or two.